Last week you began a fermentation with yeast and sugar to produce ethanol. This week the point of the lab is to determine how successful that fermentation was. Of course, you need to be sure you're in dress code and wearing goggles. You should always have those on when you're preparing to do the lab. Everyone will work in a ventilated cabinet. All of the equipment you need is inside, except for the glassware which you'll find in your drawer. In order to access it, you need to lift the cover, and you can't let go of it until it's resting against the black tape. At this point, you can set up your experiment inside and return the cover back to its original position when you're finished. You should already have filtered out the sea light from your fermentation sample and have a mostly clear liquid in your ground glass 125 milliliter Erlenmeyer flask. This is different from regular Erlenmeyers because it has a polished glass surface. Make sure to use this. You'll also need a stir bar. This is a little magnet that you can slide into the flask. Don't drop it because you might break the glass. Just tilt it onto the side and drop it down the side of the flask. At that point, you can take this and clamp it onto your hot plate. This will be tightened just by taking your hand and screwing the two pieces together, but it's very important to maintain contact with the hot plate. If you don't have sufficient contact, you won't have a fast enough heating sample, and you won't be able to finish your distillation in time. In your lab drawer, you'll find most but not all of the pieces you need to do today's lab. Some of the pieces are common equipment, which means they must be returned to the fume hood by the end of the lab period. The common equipment pieces are the packed condenser, the condenser with cooling hoses, and the blue Keck clamps. You'll need 3 Keck clamps, your vacuum connecting tube, the condenser with hoses, sidearm connecting tube, and the packed condenser. You might need grease because these ground glass joint ends need to have a little bit of grease in order to not stick together when you assemble the apparatus. You'll need the straight arm connecting tube, some glycerin, the thermometer holder, a thermometer, a wire mesh net, and your 10 milliliter graduated cylinder. Again, please return the common equipment that does not belong in your drawer by the end of the lab period. Assembly is pretty straightforward, but you need to make sure not to take this apart without the clamps in place, or things can fall apart. Again, you might need to use a little bit of the grease in the grease can if the ground glass joints on the ends of the pieces are not already greased up. But it's pretty straightforward to insert one ground glass joint into the other. So you'll need the sidearm. We'll have both the packed condenser as well as the cooling condenser. And on the end, you'll put the vacuum connecting tube. If you twist them a little bit, it kind of makes the seal a little bit better. Finally, each of those 3 connections will have a blue Keck clamp connecting them to make it a little bit more secure. They can fit on in one direction. So if it doesn't snap on, don't try to force it, but instead switch 180 degrees. Basically, the wider end of the Keck clamp fits over the wider end of your assembly. So it wouldn't fit like this, but instead like the following. So now we've connected those 2 together. We have one more Keck clamp for this connection. And finally, we have one more for our vacuum connecting tube. These valves are usually connected, but there's a small metal clasp you push in to pull them apart. Just a word of caution, a lot of these are old and stick. You might have to pull pretty hard to separate the water valves. This whole apparatus you're going to carry together over to your ventilated cabinet and set it into the already clamped 125 ml ground glass Erlenmeyer. Take your completely assembled apparatus and bring it over to the cabinet. Set the ground glass end of the packed condenser into your 125 ml Erlenmeyer. Make sure it still stays secure on the hot plate. Sometimes these things get disrupted a bit. And then you'll have the water hoses inside the ventilated cabinet, and you'll want to connect the white hose from your condenser to the white hose that's in your hood, and the orange hose from your condenser to the orange hose in your hood. They're color-coded so you can't screw it up. Sometimes the valves are sticky, you have to push pretty hard. Sometimes they're hard to separate. Sometimes the apparatus can move when you're attaching the hoses, and you need to be careful, but you can always adjust it after the hoses have been connected. Now you'll be able to have cooling water running through your condenser so that you can cool the vapors in your distillation back to liquid and collect them for analysis. We're almost done with the assembly, but we need to know at which temperature our vapors are distilling from our sample. To do that, we need to attach a thermometer. You need the straight arm connecting tube and a thermometer holder, which fit together with the rubber over the top of the glass. And you want to be careful not to insert the thermometer without some glycerin in the top. So you find bottles of glycerin all over the lab. You just need to apply a small amount to the top hole. And then your thermometer, which is found in your drawer, can slide in easily. You need to put it down pretty far, but not too far, before you carry it over to the apparatus and assemble it in the last spot that has an open connection, the top of your sidearm connecting tube. Take the thermometer assembly over to the cabinet, and it's a little bit tricky, but you have to hold it at an angle so that you can get the thermometer holder and straight connecting tube to fit into the top connection. Unfortunately, we're not going to have the right measurement of the temperature if we keep the thermometer bulb that far down. So what we need to do is hold on and pull up the thermometer until it gets to this point where the vapors will be departing the condensed tube or the packing tube and entering the condensation tube. So the thermometer bulb needs to be even with the sidearm once it's connected, and at this point you cannot remove the thermometer or you'll break it because your entire apparatus is a bit too tall to remove that thermometer. You're almost done with the assembly, just 2 more steps. Now to collect your fractions, take one of the pieces of wire mesh that are on top of the chillers in the lab and set it on the ring stand, or the iron ring. This will provide kind of a stable platform to collect your fractions. You can find a 10 milliliter graduated cylinder in your lab drawer and try to position that as best you can underneath the outlet of your vacuum connecting tube. This is where the ethanol fermentation product is going to be dripping out, and you'll need to collect it in here. Finally, once your TA has inspected your apparatus, you can turn on the heat, but not until that happens. Your TA is going to look for contact on the hot plate to make sure that this is not above the hot plate and that the joints are all safely connected, nothing's loose, and most importantly, that you have cooling water circulated. You can see bubbles in the tube right here. It's pretty easy to turn on the stirrer. You just turn stir up to say something like 6. That'll keep bumping from occurring. And finally, once your TA has inspected your apparatus, you can turn the heat on, but not until that happens. So good luck with your distillation. Remember, the product of this experiment is not for human consumption. Every fermentation contains some methanol, which is toxic. Thanks and good luck.